Our next speaker is Chris Nyaga. I'm sure I didn't pronounce it correctly. Pardon me. Chris will be talking on testing in Ruby. I think this one is an interesting one. And he's from Nairobi, Kenya. And he's also from the Kwara team, which is like one of the sponsors for this event. So please welcome Chris. Chris, over to you.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Thanks for the confirmation, Rafael. Hey everyone, I am Chris. Pleasure to be here. I'm a member of the Nairobi community. I am based in Nairobi, and I was going to talk about testing. I have 10 minutes, so I'm just going to start by mentioning I put up a message in the chat where I dropped off for a few minutes, and it's actually a funny story because I was just chatting with the rest of my some of my team members, and we had an incident in one of our production servers. It was quite the affair. We write tests and we write tests so that we're able to anticipate these kinds of challenges, but then here we are. So yeah, definitely keep on writing tests. Aka, is that you? Cool. So I thought you were something. Should I be seeing the presentation, Bernard, or should I share my screen? I'm not too sure.
Try to share your screen.
Okay, so I don't see that. I'm logged in, but I don't see that option, which is interesting.
Can you see the plus button?
I can see it now. I can see it now.
Okay.
So just give me a second to present. I'm just gonna share my window. And you know what? I'm just gonna. Okay, sorry, sorry guys. I'm just struggling a bit there with. Is this a correct one? Yeah. So someone please stop me verbally if you can't hear me or anything. I'm gonna rush through this because it's just 10 minutes. But what I basically did is I put together a slide, or I took some data. I took basically a slide that we use internally for ourselves in Kwara and for employees, where we talk about stuff like testing. So that's the content of this. It's something that we're really big champions of personally, as I said, my name is Chris. I'm based in Nairobi. I've been with the Kwara team for about a year and maybe 4 months, about there. Kwara, the company itself, has been around for I think almost 5 years now. So still a budding startup, a growing startup, and our tech stack is mostly in Ruby and Rails. So can talk more about that later. Talking about the content of the slides themselves, why do we write tests? So these are just some reasons, definitely not conclusive, but some reasons why people write tests. Validate implementation, meets acceptance criteria. How are you sure that if you're working in a Scrum setup or whatever similar alternative your team uses, then a product manager or whoever you're working with will have a checklist of does this meet it or not. And as much as your code might be somehow working, if you're not really testing each of these checklist items, then you may end up delivering something that's not up to standard. Verify that your code is working as expected. Acts as living documentation. I love this, and we'll talk more about this later. But I think the idea is, as you write your test, if someone else comes in, and there are a lot of products out there, especially corporate or even startup environments where documentation is something that you pick up along the way. Sometimes you start really well or you don't start really well, but tests are standard. It's readable. If you have clear tests, I don't need to go through the 10 different, implementation detail type of work that's going on inside your application. I can read one integration or one end-to-end test and see this input is coming in and something is happening, and this is how we're verifying that that thing happened. Prevent regression errors, speak for itself. We'll talk more about that as well. Assist in the evolution of design. Manual testing does not scale, and Ruby is a dynamic language that requires more testing than statically typed languages. Some would disagree with that. I entirely agree. Like the fact that Ruby as a dynamic language just creates more room for error is, I think that's true. So let's talk more about that later. How important is testing? So this is extracted from, I wish I had my speaker notes, I can't see them, but this there's a book that was written a few years back by Kent Beck. I can't remember the name of the book, but he was basically highlighting some of what's the priority of different things in as you write tests, as you build your application. So we have these 4 different elements, and they're ranked in order of priority. At the top, we see passes the tests. And what this basically communicates is, regardless of whatever approach you're taking in implementation detail, regardless of what you're doing, however the code looks like, passing your tests should be one of the most important, if not the most important, items in your level of priority. And this is because tests are the only defining factor that says, does your code work or not? It may be running, but does it work? So if it passes the test, it works. In between, we have reveals intention and no duplication. Earlier, we just mentioned that tests can act as living documentation, and that's how we're revealing intention, because it's uh, in your application. If someone was to walk through the structure of your work, it may not exactly be as easy to understand. Like, not every file easily reveals its purpose in the hierarchy, but then if one way or another your project runs and ensures your test passes, then passing your test is at the top, but in between we have how much your code reveals the intention of why it's there. Alongside it, we have no duplication, something that you may have heard about. These are other concerns, as you can see, not really testing. And lastly, fewest elements, where there are so many discussions that happen about different type, how complexity is in different applications. And if you've worked in a big Rails app, if you haven't, just find one big open source Rails app or look at Rails itself, and you'll see how so many elements working together can be confusing, but sometimes fewer elements can be better, but it's not really as important as our tests. That's the reason for the illustration, or the case I'm trying to make here. So many tools are available for you to use in testing: Capybara, FactoryBot, Faker, Shoulder, RSpec, Favorite, which I would really want RSpec to be everyone's favorite. It's my personal favorite. I mean, it just does a lot, and it's what a big chunk of the entire community uses. And we have, of course, Selenium, Timecop, VCR, RevMock. Happy to chat about these tools later, have more in-depth discussions about pros and cons and everything. But just put up a slide with this. Some different types of tests. The most common ones you'll hear, and at least we can all agree exist as different dimensions of tests. We have unit test and integration tests. Where unit testing, or what I have here is unit testing helps check the correctness of code in isolation, often in the context of a specific class, whereas integration tests check that the interactions between different classes are as expected. Unit tests are generally faster, whereas integration tests are slower. And this is how just it is, because in unit testing you're just testing in isolation, and it's quite fast for most test runners to spin up one Ruby file or one Ruby class in context and test a bunch of things inside there. An easy example, this is literally pulled out of one of our models in Kwara. And you can see, like in some places, we test associations and we test validations, and we can see that these are just normal tests. There's nothing too fancy here, and this is how simple. You just start with simple tests. You don't have to be testing only the complex functions. Just test a simple function like, do your associations work correctly? Because the only if you don't, then one day maybe you haven't tested your association, but you use it everywhere, and someone will make a typo and change the organization association and just bring production down. So test everything is my advice. An example of integration test here, you can see this is another test copy pasted from our testing from one of our Rails applications, and we can see we just have RSpec. We're testing a get endpoint for banks, and we can see that we have our subject as a request and response, and then we have the stuff that is being requested, right? So we have some stuff to set up environment and a simple test that just checks this HTTP status code if it's okay. And of course, there's a lot more logic that will go on in more complex endpoints where you have to build some extra data, some validations are happening, you need to prepare for them, but it all happens in your tests. An interesting topic as well here for when to start versus when to mock. I don't think I'm even as the good at deciding sometimes when I want to start or mock, but sometimes it is relevant. Some of the things that we discussed when we had the session were when you want to limit the scope of a particular test, you can stub the behavior of certain entities because you just don't want to deal with the complexities of setting them up because there's a dependency. So you just say this random class, when called with this function, just give me true or give me X and Y, because making that work inside the test behind the scenes will just be too much work. So when you have to is a good point, and if you don't really have to, have your tests replicate real world scenario. But if you have to, then you can consider stubbing or mocking. Um, when doing so, when not doing so, will result in testing too much or testing code too much, which is basically what I'm saying. Like if you realize that as much you can spend some extra energy trying to set it up, but it doesn't really matter here. This is probably tested in another place, and because it's an integration test and you need to test the behavior in a different, or the behavior is being dependent on by something else, then you can decide to just not test it in that scenario. I think I'm almost out of 10 minutes. One of the last things I wanted to mention is test driven and just fast development. Um, some principles you can decide to consider, not a single line of code until there's a test. Write the test, write the least amount of code to get the test passing. I mean, some people prefer TDD, some people don't. It's a nice approach to building software, in my opinion, because you start with a failing test and it forces you to think about the design of the interface or whatever you're exposing, the usage scenario, what kind of data you'll be requiring to perform this action, and or what is the ideal data that needs to be provided to your abstraction, to your controller or endpoint, to whatever you're testing to create the expected outcome. So I encourage you to consider this, test-driven development. Maybe next time we'll have a session, we'll try and build something using TDD. For TDD, after the red and green stages, there is the third stage, refactor. With ping pong pair programming, one developer will write the test and the other will get the test to pass. Is test fast the holy grail? Maybe it was necessary to use test fast as the counterintuitive round for breaking down the industry's sorry lack of automated regression testing. TDD is dead, long live testing. I just encourage you to read this article. I'll send the link here. But this is a take from someone a while back. Anything else here? Readability, reduce reduplication, use things like meta and subject if you're, to help you write better tests and cleaner tests. Use custom matches when you're using tools like RSpec. They're amazing. They help you have very clean code. this is another copy-pasted one of a custom matcher in one of our applications, and it allows us to write a test like this eventually. So you can do, expect sheet to have header cells this, and we use this in every place where it's relevant because, for example, I think this is some places where we're generating reports and it makes sense. Instead of the alternative here where we would have to dig into this sheet, do all this hackery, and this is not really easily readable and we'd have to replicate it everywhere we use it. So whenever you identify patterns that you can encode within custom matchers, I highly encourage you because they can really help clean up your tests. I think that's the last slide I actually had. I tried to make this as short as possible. As I mentioned, let me stop sharing so it stops looking weird. I'm Chris, I'm from Kwara. I will send a link to our room. We're not that many, so that's why we don't have a room already created, but I'll be available later to have a chat with folks who are interested in some of the open roles we have, because we are looking for senior Ruby devs and as well full stack engineers if there are any like those here. So pleasure being part of this community, guys, and back to you, Bernard.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris, for the wonderful presentation.